Before the world learned the name Avatar, before nations rose and fell in fire and blood, balance was not a word spoken in fear. It was simply the way things were. The wind moved when it wished. The oceans breathed with the moon. Mountains stood not as borders, but as witnesses. In this age, the world was not ruled by kings or armies, but by forces older than memory, forces that did not ask for worship, only respect. The earliest age of this world belonged to the spirits. They moved freely between realms, unseen but ever present, shaping rivers, storms, forests, and flame. To the spirits, the world was not divided into nations or peoples. It was whole. Every action echoed outward. Every imbalance demanded correction. Humanity, by contrast, was small and uncertain, clinging to survival in the shadow of powers it could not control. Villages were built with reverence, not conquest, and fear was often the price of ignorance rather than malice. It was during this fragile coexistence that bending first emerged, not as a weapon, but as a gift. Humans learned to move with the elements instead of against them. Fire was warmth before it was war. Water was healing before it was conquest. Earth was shelter before it was domination. Air was freedom before it was loss. These abilities were not taken. They were taught, passed down through harmony with the natural world and the spirits who governed it. Bending was never meant to rule the world. It was meant to live within it, but balance is not static. It is a living tension, forever tested by desire. As humanity grew, so did its ambition. Villages became cities. Traditions hardened into identities. Identity gave birth to pride, and pride slowly turned toward ownership. The elements, once shared, became claimed. Lines were drawn where none had existed before, and with them came the first quiet fractures in the world harmony. The spirits felt this shift long before humans did. They sensed the strain between realms, the growing imbalance caused not by evil, but by accumulation. Too much power, too much certainty, too much hunger. Where once the physical and spirit worlds flowed together, they now pressed against each other like colliding tides. The world was still standing, but it was no longer at peace. In response, the universe itself sought correction. Not through destruction, but through mediation. Balance did not demand a conqueror. It demanded a bridge. The idea of an intermediary did not arrive as prophecy or decree. It emerged as a necessity. Someone who could stand in both worlds without belonging fully to either. Someone who could carry power without being consumed by it. Someone who would live not for themselves, but for the fragile space between order and chaos. This was not a blessing. It was a burden the world had not yet learned to name. Long before the first avatar drew breath, the conditions for their existence were already set. The world was moving toward conflict not because it was broken, but because it was changing. Every generation pushed the balance slightly further, believing progress and harmony were the same thing. They were not. Harmony required restraint. Progress demanded more. The spirits began to withdraw. Forests grew restless. Oceans became unpredictable. Fire burned hotter, wilder. Earth itself resisted being shaped. These were not acts of cruelty, but warnings. Signals that the world was drifting from the delicate equilibrium that sustained it. Humanity, however, heard only challenge, not caution. In these early centuries, there was no single war, no great villain, no clear enemy to blame. The threat was quieter and far more dangerous. It was the belief that balance could be controlled rather than respected. That power could be divided cleanly without consequence. That the world could be mastered. This was the world into which the Avatar would eventually be born, not as a savior descending from the heavens, but as an answer to a problem no one fully understood. The Avatar was never meant to rule, nor to be worshipped. They were meant to listen, to feel the imbalance before it became catastrophe, to act when others could not, and to suffer the cost of that action alone. Yet even in this age, before the first Avatar's name was ever spoken, the shape of tragedy was already forming. Because to stand between worlds is to belong to neither. To hold all elements is to be claimed by all conflicts. And to preserve balance is to make enemies of those who benefit from its absence. The ancient world did not fear the Avatar yet. It did not know such a figure would exist. But it was already preparing the weight that would one day be placed upon a single soul. A soul that would return again and again, not because it wished to, but because the world would never stop needing correction. Balance, in this age, was still possible without sacrifice. That would not last. The farther humanity moved from humility, the more severe the correction would need to be. And when the Avatar finally emerged, it would not mark the beginning of peace, but the end of innocence. Because the moment balance requires a guardian, it has already been lost. And so the stage was set, not for a hero's journey, but for a cycle of responsibility without end. A story not of triumph, but of endurance. Long before war, long before legend, long before the world learned to speak the word Avatar with hope, or with fear. The world did not change all at once. It cracked slowly, quietly, until one moment made the damage impossible to ignore. The divide between the spirit world and the physical realm widened not with thunder, but with neglect. Spirits once gentle became hostile. Lands once fertile grew unstable. Humanity, unaware of the cost of its certainty, pushed forward anyway. And in that widening fracture, the first Avatar was born, not by destiny alone, but by desperation. Long before the Avatar was a symbol, there was only a human caught between forces far greater than themselves. A world spiraling toward chaos does not ask for heroes. It demands balance, no matter the price. The first Avatar did not seek power. They were not crowned, chosen, or celebrated. They were forged in the collision between human ambition and spiritual consequence, at a moment when the universe could no longer remain divided. At the heart of this moment stood two ancient forces, one embodying light, order, and balance, the other chaos, destruction, and endless change. Their struggle was older than humanity itself, a cycle of conflict that shaped reality without ever resolving it. For countless ages, this battle remained contained within the spirit realm. But as humans disrupted the natural harmony of the world, that conflict began to spill outward. The barrier between realms weakened, and the consequences became impossible to ignore. It was then that a single human stepped into the storm. The merging of human and spirit was not an act of triumph. It was an act of sacrifice. To bind oneself to a cosmic force meant surrendering the simplicity of a single lifetime. The spirit of light did not offer glory. It offered responsibility without end. In accepting it, the first Avatar ceased to live for themselves alone. Their soul became an anchor, tethered eternally to the fate of the world. With this union came unimaginable power. The ability to wield all four elements was not learned, it was imposed. Fire, water, earth, and air no longer existed as separate disciplines, but as parts of a single will. For the first time, balance had a voice, a form, and a presence that could act directly upon the world. The Avatar stood as proof that harmony could be enforced when it could no longer be trusted to exist on its own. But power reshapes the one who carries it. The first Avatar quickly learned that balance is not peace. To restore harmony often meant choosing who would suffer and who would be spared. Every intervention carried consequences. Every correction created resentment. Spirit saw the Avatar as a necessary compromise. Humans saw them as something unnatural, too powerful to trust, too human to revere without fear. The cost was immediate and permanent. When the first Avatar died, the spirit of light did not depart. Instead, it followed the soul into rebirth, binding the cycle forever. This was the moment fate became inheritance. No future Avatar would ever choose their path. They would awaken into it, burdened by memories not their own, carrying the weight of decisions made centuries before their birth. Reincarnation was not a gift. It was a sentence. Each lifetime would begin in ignorance and end in sacrifice. Each Avatar would be forced to relearn the world they were sworn to protect, only to watch it resist their efforts all over again. The spirit of light ensured continuity, but it could not guarantee wisdom. That would have to be earned anew, at the cost of pain and loss. As word of the Avatar spread, reactions fractured along familiar lines. Some saw hope, a living bridge that could heal what had been broken. Others saw a threat, a single being capable of overturning nations. Fear spread faster than understanding ever could. And fear, when left unchecked, becomes policy. The first Avatar tried to teach balance, but the world listened only when force was applied. And every time the Avatar acted, the line between guardian and ruler blurred. The burden grew heavier with each life, each conflict, each failure that could not be undone. What began as a solution slowly revealed itself as a cycle. A necessary one, perhaps, but a tragic one. The Avatar could correct imbalance, but never erase its cause. Humanity would continue to desire more. Spirits would continue to respond. And the Avatar would stand between them, absorbing the consequences so the world could keep moving forward. In this way, the Avatar became history's silent constant. Wars would be remembered. Empires would be recorded. But the sacrifices of the Avatar would fade into myth, retold as legend rather than loss. The world would praise balance while rarely appreciating the price paid to maintain it. By the end of the first Avatar's life, the truth had become clear. Balance was no longer natural. It was enforced. And enforcement required a warden, one who would never truly rest. Thus, the Avatar cycle was sealed. From that moment onward, every birth carried an echo of the first choice. Every death ensured the burden would pass on. The Avatar would never escape the world's need for correction, because the world would never stop creating imbalance. This was the binding of fate, not just for one soul, but for all who would follow. A legacy written not in victory, but in repetition. A promise that as long as the world struggled, the Avatar would rise again. The Avatar returned, again and again, but the world did not always welcome them. Each incarnation arrived with whispers of hope, yet carried the weight of suspicion, expectation, and dread. To some, they were a godlike figure, a living bridge between the mortal and spirit realms. To others, they were a weapon, a being whose power could undo kings and empires alike. And through it all, the Avatar stood as a reminder that balance had a face, and that face could never belong entirely to any nation or people. In the earliest generations of the Avatar cycle, humanity had still glimpsed harmony. Villages bent to the rhythms of nature, and small communities worked alongside spirits rather than against them. But as the cycle repeated, as Avatars were born, lived, and died, a pattern emerged. Power, once a tool of protection, became an instrument of fear. Nations began to see the Avatar not as a guardian, but as a variable to control, a threat to influence, and a prize to claim. Reverence turned to caution, and caution hardened into suspicion. It was the first time the world learned that balance was not always welcome. Every Avatar carried the memories of lives that had come before, echoes of choices and failures embedded in their consciousness. They knew that past victories could be fragile, past mistakes could ripple across centuries. Yet this knowledge was double-edged. It offered wisdom, but it also marked them as apart, forever different from those around them. People saw the glow of their presence and sensed an unspoken truth. The Avatar's allegiance was never fully theirs. Loyalty was owed to the world, not to any ruler, nation, or family. And that truth frightened everyone. Kings and generals moved carefully around this reality. In times of peace, they courted the Avatar with gifts and flattery, attempting to mold them into symbols of political power. In times of war, they feared the Avatar's intervention, sometimes seeking to eliminate or neutralize them before their influence could tip the scales. The Avatar, despite unparalleled abilities, was never entirely free. They were constantly measured, manipulated, and tested by the very people they sought to protect. This precarious position would become the defining characteristic of the cycle. Power tempered by isolation, reverence shadowed by fear. Yet, for all this tension, the Avatar remained an agent of correction. When imbalance arose, when a nation overreached, or spirits lashed out in fury, the Avatar acted. And every act carried weight far beyond its immediate effect. Stopping a war in one region could spark fear in another. Healing a rift between humans and spirits might provoke envy among the powerful. Each intervention was a lesson that balance was not a gift to be taken lightly. It was a force that demanded sacrifice, judgment, and unrelenting vigilance. The psychological toll of this responsibility was immense. Even the strongest Avatars struggled with the knowledge that their actions could never satisfy everyone, that no life could be saved without causing loss somewhere else. Some Avatars were revered as living legends, celebrated in song and story, but even these tales often obscured the isolation, doubt, and sorrow endured in silence. The world saw a figure of power. The Avatar felt the weight of inevitability. And yet, the cycle persisted. Humanity's repeated mistakes, greed, and ambition ensured it. Empires would rise and fall. Wars would erupt over borders, belief, or resources. The spiritual world would respond, sometimes violently. And in every era, the Avatar would reappear, carrying the memories of all those who came before, a living link to the past and the only hope for future correction. This repeated pattern also taught the world fear. Fear of the Avatar's power. Fear of the judgment that could arrive at any moment. Fear that one's actions, no matter how well-intentioned, might be undone or punished by a force beyond comprehension. And as fear spread, so too did mistrust, not just of the Avatar, but of one another. People began to question whether they could govern themselves without a constant arbiter, where the nations could exist without a force imposing limits. Balance, which had once been a natural state, was now a fragile concept upheld by a single soul's endurance. Yet even amidst fear, there were moments of awe, moments when the Avatar's presence illuminated the potential for harmony. When villages were saved from drought, when rivers were guided back to their channels, when spirits were soothed into calm, people glimpsed the promise of unity. It was a reminder that the Avatar was not merely a tool of enforcement, but a mediator, a protector, and a bridge. But these moments were always fleeting. The world never paused long enough to appreciate them fully. For every act of restoration, a new imbalance would emerge, and the cycle would begin anew. By the time the cycle had matured across generations, a bitter paradox had taken hold. The Avatar was necessary, yet feared; revered, yet distrusted; loved, yet never fully understood. Humanity had come to rely on a force it could never fully comprehend or control, and this reliance shaped civilizations in ways both subtle and profound. Politics, warfare, and belief were no longer guided by ideals alone. They were influenced by the shadow of a power that could undo or enforce them at will. And through it all, the Avatars themselves endured. Their lives, though separated by decades or centuries, were bound by continuity. They carried the scars of previous conflicts, the wisdom of countless battles, and the weight of expectations that no ordinary being could withstand. They lived with the knowledge that failure was not an option, because failure would reverberate across generations. Yet success did not guarantee peace. The world's fear never truly vanished. In this way, the cycle taught a hard lesson. Balance is not a reward, nor a state of grace. It is an obligation, a burden, and a responsibility that must be upheld relentlessly. The world would never know true serenity, for as long as humans existed with ambition and spirits existed with power, imbalance was inevitable. And so the Avatar remained, the eternal constant in a universe defined by uncertainty, the living reminder that harmony can only be preserved through vigilance, courage, and sacrifice. The world learned to fear the Avatar, yes, but it also learned that fear could not erase necessity. The cycle had begun, and there would be no end. No matter the century, no matter the nation, no matter the empire, the Avatar would rise again. To intervene, to endure, to stand as the world's living conscience, even when it feared the reflection staring back. The world was no longer a place of simple harmony. Villages had grown into cities, cities into nations, and nations into empires. Each claimed mastery over their element, and with mastery came ambition. The four nations, water, earth, fire, and air, began to define themselves not by coexistence, but by dominance, ideology, and pride. The Avatar, once a bridge between realms, now found themselves scrutinized, courted, and manipulated by those who saw in them a tool to validate power or enforce control. Balance had become a concept shaped by politics, not nature. The Fire Nation, with its relentless drive, saw the Avatar as either a weapon to harness or an obstacle to destroy. The Earth Kingdom, vast and unyielding, sought to use the Avatar as a symbol of authority and unity. The Water Tribes revered the Avatar as a protector of cycles and survival. The Air Nomads, more spiritual than political, hoped to guide the Avatar toward purity of purpose, yet they could not shield them from the weight of worldly ambition. Across continents, the Avatar was both unifying presence and dangerous outsider, an entity whose allegiance could never be claimed, yet whose actions could redefine the world. This era saw the emergence of calculated diplomacy, of quiet power struggles, of alliances formed for appearance rather than trust. Every act of mediation the Avatar performed became a test of loyalty, a gamble with political currents that could erupt violently at any moment. Every attempt to restore harmony revealed the fragility of peace, as ambition silently eroded unity. Balance remained, but it was artificial, strained, and constantly contested. Even the spirits observed these changes with growing concern. Lands became disputed, waters poisoned, skies shadowed by smoke. The delicate weave of natural and spiritual order frayed at the edges. And the Avatar, caught between worlds and nations, carried the impossible task of holding this tapestry together, knowing that any misstep could unravel centuries of fragile stability. Thus, the stage was set for a world in which the Avatar was no longer simply a guide, but a symbol of fear, a constant reminder that the forces of ambition and desire would always challenge balance. In this fractured era, harmony was no longer granted, it had to be enforced. And the Avatar, as always, would be the first to bear the cost. For the first time, the impossible weight of responsibility became painfully clear. Despite centuries of power, despite knowledge inherited from lifetimes past, the Avatar could not prevent catastrophe. Wars erupted faster than intervention could arrive. Empires overreached, and innocent lives were lost in the shadows of ambition. No amount of foresight, wisdom, or bending mastery could stop the consequences of human desire. The first failures left deep scars. Villages were destroyed before the Avatar could arrive. Families were torn apart. Cultural traditions vanished. And with each missed opportunity, doubt began to spread, both in the world and within the Avatar themselves. Humanity had relied on them for balance, yet the Avatar was finite, vulnerable, painfully human in a universe that demanded divine perfection. This was the era in which the paradox of the Avatar became undeniable, necessary yet imperfect, revered yet distrusted. People began questioning whether the Avatar truly saved the world, or merely delayed its collapse. Even the spirits, witnesses of centuries, seemed to withhold guidance, leaving the Avatar to navigate suffering without clear instruction. Yet failure did not mean inaction. Every intervention, every choice, carried a moral weight that would echo for lifetimes. The Avatar learned that correction could not always be absolute, that sacrifice was inevitable, and that preserving balance sometimes meant accepting loss. This period set the tone for all Avatars to follow: power without certainty, influence without trust, and the unshakable knowledge that the world might never see the cost paid to protect it. When ambition turns to obsession, peace becomes impossible. The Fire Nation's rise was not subtle, it was cataclysmic. Entire cities fell under flame. Cultures vanished. And the world, already fragile, entered a century defined by terror. This was not conquest born of necessity. It was dominance born of desire, and it reshaped the world in fire and shadow. The Avatar, the only being capable of restoring balance on a global scale, was absent. Hope faltered. Legends of past intervention became stories whispered to children to soothe fear. The air nomads were wiped out, spiritual and cultural anchors erased in a single violent sweep. The cycle had been broken, not by defeat, but by absence. In this dark age, the world learned a harsh truth: balance is meaningless without presence to enforce it. Fire, unchecked, became a force that consumed history itself. And in that devastation, the Avatar's role was revealed in stark clarity, not as a hero, but as a constant, the only force capable of guiding the world back from oblivion. This era would define the stakes for all Avatars yet to come. A century passed before hope returned, not in thunder or triumph, but in ice. From the frozen seas emerged a child, small, reluctant, but bearing the weight of an entire world: Aang, the last airbender. He had been asleep in time, preserved by circumstance, yet the world had moved on, leaving him a relic of a lost people and a civilization on the brink of chaos. Aang's awakening was not joyous. It was sudden, terrifying, and full of expectation. He inherited the cumulative weight of every Avatar that had come before, alongside the guilt of survival when so many had perished. Every step forward was haunted by absence, every choice burdened with responsibility. Aang was a child, yet the world demanded wisdom. He was the last voice of a culture erased, the final bridge between humanity and spirits, and the one person capable of stopping the Fire Nation. This chapter of history is defined not by power, but by sorrow. The Avatar returned, carrying hope, yet also the impossible expectations of a world that had nearly lost all reason to hope at all. The final confrontations demanded not strength alone, but judgment. Victory was not measured by power, but by restraint. The Avatar stood at a crossroads, forced to choose between enforcing justice with violence or preserving mercy at the cost of potential chaos. Ancient philosophies of balance collided with modern realities of war and ambition. Every decision carried irreversible consequences. Friends became potential victims. Enemies became moral dilemmas. The world expected resolution, yet balance could not be forced without consequence. This was the moral core of the Avatar's journey, understanding that true power is not measured in dominance, but in the ability to act wisely, compassionately, and with foresight, even when it breaks the heart to do so. Empires crumble quietly, yet their collapse is thunderous in impact. The Fire Nation's defeat did not come through annihilation, but through the removal of unjust authority. Cities were spared where destruction had been promised. Cultures endured where war had threatened to erase them. Balance was restored, but it was altered forever. The Avatar succeeded not by sheer force, but by redefining victory itself. This was a triumph tempered with sorrow. The world could breathe, yet the scars of ambition and violence remained visible. The cycle had held. Balance returned, but it was a fragile, hard-won peace. Peace does not erase the past. Even after war, the world bore the marks of conflict. Political boundaries remained fragile, cultural wounds remained raw, and mistrust lingered in the hearts of those who survived. Reconstruction revealed not only what had been lost, but what remained unresolved. The Avatar's role shifted from warrior to mediator, from symbol to guide. The responsibilities endured, but the battles changed. Balance was no longer a destination, but a process, a constant vigilance requiring diplomacy, wisdom, and patience. Humanity had survived war, yet it had not yet learned to coexist fully in harmony. Generations passed, and the world evolved. Spirituality waned as technology rose, reshaping society in ways the previous avatars could not have foreseen. Korra emerged in this transformed era, inheriting the legacy of her predecessors, yet facing challenges they had never imagined. Her battles were as much ideological as physical. Political upheaval, technological power, and fading spiritual connection created new imbalances. Korra had the strength and skill, but she also bore the weight of expectations impossible to fulfill. Legacy, in this era, became a burden rather than an honor, and the Avatar's role required reinvention to survive in a world that no longer understood the full meaning of balance. In the end, the Avatar is never a single person. They are a symbol, a warning, and a testament to the fragility of balance. Generations come and go, empires rise and fall, and yet the cycle persists. The world remembers the Avatar only when imbalance becomes intolerable. The legend endures not because of guaranteed success, but because of unwavering persistence. The Avatar returns, time and again, to stand as the guardian of a universe that constantly tests its limits. History does not tell the story of flawless triumph, but of enduring sacrifice. And in that enduring presence lies the true meaning of the Avatar. Not a savior, not a conqueror, but a witness, a mediator, and the eternal reminder that balance is fragile, fleeting, and worth every effort to preserve.